Welcome to Lecture 1. This is the first lecture of 3 for the Teaching Academic Writing course that we're doing. And the first focus question for this lecture is, why do students struggle to write like I want them to write? We're going to talk about what is good writing and just point out a few differences between oral language and written language. Because the main thing I'm going to put forward today is that students often write with a more spoken-like style, but what we are expecting from them is a more written-like style. And so we have to meet them in the middle and scaffold their learning so that if they're writing in a spoken-like form, they're able to progress and to develop and draft their writing to become more written-like as we go through. Now, a few of these key terms here on the side are hopefully things that by our seminars you'll have an ability to define what each of them actually mean. Okay, I'll start this with an example. What point sentence would you prefer to see your students construct? I'll give you the context in a moment, but let's look at the sentences first. So, the first one. I think people moved from their farms to the cities because some things started to change in the area and people needed to make money to help their families live. This is A. And B. The agricultural revolution in Britain forced people to move from villages to cities as improvements in farming led to people seeking work in major cities. These are two student responses. So which one would you prefer to see? Here's the context. We've got a Year 9 history peel paragraph task. The question is, explain the impact of the agricultural revolution on rural life. And this is one sentence part of a much larger peel paragraph that's trying to answer a particular question that we have above. It's not really that much of a trick. The B response is the one that, I would like to see in this teaching context. Here's some reasons why B is actually a more written-like response, or the response that we're looking to see. It uses correct subject words like agricultural revolution, uses third person, which we always like to say, but maybe don't understand why. It makes a point that can actually be expanded on, which is the whole point of a peel paragraph. It uses bigger words, like improvements as opposed to change. It's more specific in its meaning, so farming improvements is much different than things started to change. And it gives more contextual information as well, like it spells out the country that this happened in. So it shows a bit more knowledge about the subject area. Now, I'll say in this writing task, in this context, A is a more spoken-like piece of writing, and B is a more written-like piece of writing. But what's the reason for this difference? Why have two students with the same question, with the same task, created something completely different? It comes down to their personal understanding of the purpose and the context of the task. And you see that triangle there. You've got the text in the middle, and then around it you've got the surrounding context, which I'm going to call field, tenor, and mode of the text. Each of these influence the text. That's why the triangles for text is in the middle. But the students are demonstrating that they have a different understanding of these three terms, field, tenor, and mode. So what is field, tenor, and mode? Well, field is simply the topic or the subject of the text. In this case, it's the Industrial Revolution. In your case, it may be a particular topic in science or biology or PDH, PE. The field can be a very broad field, like an entire subject, or it can be very, very specific, such as talking about agricultural developments. The field needs to be taught. This is usually our content, but it also needs to be understood. And when a task is completed, students need to know that they're writing about a specific field. The second word, tenor, relates to the relationship between the writer and the reader, so the composer and responder. And in this case, it's a student writing to a teacher, but these can vary. Each text can be different. A text message to a loved one has a very different tenor or context expectation compared to maybe a textbook where the writer is assuming that they're an expert and the reader is trying to learn, and that affects the language that's used. Finally, the mode. This is the channel of communication. You can think of it like the text type. In this case, it's a more analysis paragraph as opposed to an opinion piece. But the mode is the structure and the expectations within that structure that are pretty common. Okay, just quickly, these sentences here, just based on the sentence themselves, I've kind of outlined what I believe are the field, tenor, and mode understandings that each of these students have had when they've created these paragraphs. And you'll see there, which you can pause, it comes down to basically just how specific the understanding of the field, tenor, and mode is. If we take the first example, the B example, the more written-like response, the field is the impact of the agricultural revolution on rural life, whereas the field for the other more spoken-like text is it's an opinion of the impact of moving from a rural area to the city, which is not actually the question, although it's almost the question. The tenor is different as well. A teacher is assessing a student's expert knowledge, and that's being reflected in the word choices and the structure of the text, whereas the student of the more spoken-like text is assuming it's more of an opinion piece, which is, you can see by the use of first person. The mode for the more written-like response is a more formal academic point sentence that summarizes a main idea and can be expanded on, whereas the mode for the more spoken-like text is actually a sentence that can be used in isolation and can't necessarily be expanded on in too much more detail because it doesn't have any more, it doesn't put forward an idea. It doesn't put forward a case. It actually puts forward just a simple idea. Okay, the main differences between spoken-like and written-like language. Spoken-like is usually more present tense. It's first person usually. It has a lower lexical density, which I'll talk about in a moment. It uses more grammatical words, and it has an implied context, which we all know. If we're speaking to somebody, we're usually in an environment that the other person is in as well, and so we don't need to talk too much about context because it's implied. Whereas a written-like text is the opposite. Usually uses past tense because it's writing about a past experience. It's third person. It has a higher lexical density. It uses more lexical words, which are information words, and it has a more explicit context that needs to be explained. Now, this thing is awesome because it helps spell out, in particular for students, what the differences are between spoken-like and written-like language. So a mode continuum simply tries to clearly show how text can evolve from a more spoken-like form to a more written-like form. Now, this first one, you can already assume the context without looking at more written-like text, but it's more difficult to understand what exactly is being spoken about. You'll see in the first box there, it says, look, it's making the move, those didn't stick. It's a first-hand experience that's being described. Whereas as we move along, the context becomes more explicit through the language choices. So the second box, we found out the pins stuck on the magnet. The third one, our experiment showed that magnets attract some metals. So the word experiment is refining the field a little bit more. It's clear that we're talking about a science experiment. And finally, magnetic attraction occurs only between ferrous metals. It's using more technical, specific language that is connected to this subject area. The student is showing a deep knowledge of the forces that are going on in this experiment, as opposed to the first one, it simply being an observation. Our goal when it comes to writing is actually moving students along from their more spoken-like responses to their formal written-like observations, because that's what we're looking for in stage 6. Okay, lexical density. This is not something that I would throw out in a year 7 classroom, okay, because it gets a bit confusing. Maths teachers might like it because we're talking about ratios here, but it's essentially the ratio between lexical words and grammatical words. Think of lexical words like the words that give information. Usually nouns and adjectives and verbs are the main lexical words that we'd have within a sentence. They're the ones that give the most meaning. And grammatical words are kind of like the glue words that if you have them by themselves, they don't make sense. Okay, they're the prepositions. Without these lexical words, it's very difficult to get any meaning or establish any context within a written text. And the more lexically dense a text is, the more information it is trying to help you understand. And you'll see this in these 2 examples in the boxes. The first one is a geography textbook, and the second one is a picture book that I just grabbed off the shelf in the library. And you'll see that the lexical density for the first textbook response is 55%, and I've highlighted the lexical words in purple, whereas the picture book, which uses visuals, it has a more implied context, has a ratio of 39%, which uses less lexical words because a lot of the information is actually being communicated through pictures. You may want to use this in a senior class, but it's honestly just for you to establish if a student's writing has a low lexical density, let's just say in the 40s, then you know that what you need to change or what you need to help scaffold is the use of lexical words within their writing. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about how we actually do that. But for now, it's just a tool. In the examples we've got, I won't go through them, but you can see that we've got a lexical density of 50 in the first one, which is actually quite high. And then in B, we've got a lexical density of 64, which is much higher. So I've just thrown a whole bunch of things at you, and I haven't explained them in too much detail because we'll do that more as we have our own discussions outside of these lectures. But this is the main points that I want you to get from these lectures. The first one is this. Students who produce spoken-like writing may not have a clear understanding of the field, tenor, and mode required in a writing task. So our goal is to actually move them along and give them a clear understanding of the field, tenor, and mode. What's required is for us to explicitly teach the expected field, tenor, and mode of a writing task, because it will help refine understanding of writing expectations. Using the mode continuum can be a great way to actually plot students in your class in a real visual way to see that they may have to move along the mode continuum to a more written-like response because their writing is not quite there in comparison to maybe some examples that you produce. And lexical density is a great way for you as a teacher to be able to see what's missing within a written response and provide some feedback. Big answer. Why do students struggle to write like I want them to write? Well, they probably don't write with the same purpose and context as you're expecting. And that's talking about the field, tenor, and mode. They may not understand the difference between spoken-like and written-like texts. They may just think that their writing is fine and it's communicating enough information. And that's where you can start to talk about the mode continuum and lexical density to help them understand the differences. And usually students struggle to write the way that you want them to write because they just don't have the tools that they need to actually write in a more written-like way. And so the next content lecture is going to focus on what are those tools that can help the student move from a more spoken-like to a written-like text.